Welcome to Live from the Ranch. My name is Ken Ramirez, and I'd like to welcome you and say good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending upon where in the world you're joining us from today. As usual, my co-host this month is Juliana DeWillems of JW Dog Training and Behavior in the Washington, D.C. area. Hi, Juliana. How are you doing today?
Hey, Ken, I am great. It's one of those months where I think we went, a full 5 weeks from seeing each other. So it's been a long time. Did you have a nice Thanksgiving holiday?
I did. I went, like, when we were on the broadcast last month, I was in Africa doing the conservation project with elephants, and I decided to take my Thanksgiving break and go check in on another conservation project that I'm doing in Argentina with macaws. And so I had a great time. Thanksgiving Day, I was trekking through the jungles of northern Argentina, watching the release of some macaws that were illegally brought into the pet trade, and they were able to be retrained and released into the wild. It's a program I've been working on for 15 years, and they have really done a great job. So I had a wonderful Thanksgiving. How about you?
Oh my gosh. Well, nothing compares to your travels. I had a very nice time here at home, but I appreciate how much you shared with us on Instagram. It felt like, we were tagging right along with you. You're showing us what animals you're seeing, where you are. And
Oh,
I think you're the only person who would say, yes, I was working on a conservation project in Argentina for my holiday. Only Ken Ramirez.
but I did come across some really cool animals, and I think the post of mine that got the most views was the one with the capybaras, which is not an extinct animal, not an endangered animal, but they were everywhere, and they're just adorable. And we had a mom with her little offspring following her into the water, which was a really cool thing to see. So,
Oh my God, that's incredible. That is so cool.
well, maybe we could talk about that at another time. I want to talk a little bit today about stress in dogs. And before we do that, I just wanted to let everybody know and remind everybody that our program today is brought to you by Karen Pryor Academy and Karen Pryor Clicker Training. And I wanted to tell everybody that we take a really innovative approach to trying to develop and support outstanding positive reinforcement trainers. And we combine online learning with hands-on coaching from some of the most experienced teachers in the field. So with KPA, you can build your skills and knowledge by enrolling in any of our preparatory courses, or if you already have modern dog training experience, you can apply to our professional certification program. And coming up in the very near future, you can check out any one of 20 different locations that we have around the world. Coming up soon, we have Fort Collins, Colorado. We have Antwerp, Belgium. We have a certification program starting in Toronto, Canada, and one in Columbus, Ohio. And then we'll have a whole new slate of opportunities in 2024. So you can learn more about KPA by visiting KarenPryorAcademy.com. So having got that out of the way, I think our dog trainer professional program is such an important program for us. Juliana is one of our wonderful instructors. But today, I want to focus on our first guest. Our only guest this month is Dr. Kristina Spaulding. Kristina has a bachelor's degree in wildlife ecology and a PhD in biopsychology, and that is the study of biological basis of behavior. She's also a certified applied animal behaviorist. And in addition, she has been in the dog training and behavior profession for over 20 years, where she's taught family dog training courses and has also done private counseling. As part of her graduate training, Dr. Spaulding was formally trained in effective teaching techniques, and she sort of fell in love with teaching people and was honored to receive an award for excellence in teaching by a graduate student. And then after earning her PhD, Dr. Spaulding's interest in teaching carried over to her applied behavior work. She currently teaches a variety of online courses and webinars on the science of behavior through her Business Science Matters Academy of Animal Behavior. And in addition to her own courses, she teaches for the IAABC Foundation and is an adjunct professor for Virginia Tech's graduate program in animal behavior and welfare. And maybe I'll ask Kristina a little bit about that, because I think that's a relatively new program that's started up in the last couple of years. Dr. Spaulding is also the author of the book called Stress Factor in Dogs, unlocking resiliency and enhancing well-being. And I'm going to talk about this book today. I found it to be a fascinating book that I think a lot of people will be really interested in. She's particularly interested in stress, neurobiology, cognition, emotion, well-being, and how to apply these concepts to the prevention, early intervention, and treatment of behavior problems in dogs. In 2019, Dr. Spaulding received the Association of Pet Dog Trainers Member of the Year Award for her work on their education committee, and she currently serves as the vice president of the IAABC Foundation Board. Kristina, Dr. Spaulding, welcome to Live from the Ranch. I'm so glad you accepted our invitation. I'm excited to talk to you today.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm happy to be here.
Well, I have so many things I want to ask you about, but for people who don't know you, beyond the biography that I just shared with everybody, tell us just a little bit about how you started your interest in animals. Did it start really young, or did it come later in life? What prompted your interest in being in the field that you're in today?
Yeah, so this is always the question where I out myself as being a major geek. So I've always been interested in animals, but I've also always loved education. So my mom likes to tell people that when I was in kindergarten, I would bring the worksheets home from kindergarten so I could work on them at home because I thought they were so fun. And then when I was in third grade, I found out what a PhD was, and I thought that was the best thing I'd ever heard. And that's when I decided I wanted to get a PhD. But I didn't go directly to graduate school from college. And actually, the reason is that my undergraduate degree was in wildlife ecology, which is the closest that I could get to animal behavior.
Uh-huh.
And I really went back and forth for a long time between, do I want to go into wildlife ecology and work on sort of conservation and animal behavior from that side of things, or do I want to be a dog trainer? And basically what happened is I graduated in 2000 and I ended up moving to New York State about a week before 9/11.
Oh,
And if anyone here, Ken, you might know this, anyone here that has a background in like wildlife ecology or conservation knows that most of the jobs are for the government. Like basically, if you're going to work in wildlife ecology, you're very highly likely to be working for the government. And New York State put a hiring freeze on all state workers as a result of 9/11. So that part of my I had these two choices and that one just got shut down. So I opened a dog training school instead. And it could have gone the other way potentially. I mean, I really wanted to do both and it was hard. Now, if I was going into the field now, it's very likely that I would have gotten involved in like conservation dogs.
right.
But I didn't know. I don't know if it even existed then, or if it did, I didn't know about it.
No,
So that's kind of,
it existed that back then, but it wasn't really well known. So
yeah, yeah. So I wouldn't say I accidentally fell into training, but I had my other primary option knocked out. And
right.
so I ended up going into training. And then once I knew that was what I really wanted to do, then I was able to go back to graduate school and get my PhD. And that's kind of how I ended up here. So, but I've always been fascinated by animal behavior. I mean, I would just sit and watch wildlife for hours.
Well, that's great. And the thing that stuck with me of all the things that you said was the fact that you dreamed about getting a PhD when you were in the third grade. To me,
I know, I'm really weird. I've never had anyone else that says, "Oh yeah, me too." No,
no, it's not one of those things that I don't think I was even thinking about working with animals when I was in the third grade. I was all over the place like so many kids are. So that's pretty remarkable. Well, one of the things that really fascinated me was reading your book, Stress Factor in Dogs. And I guess I'm curious as to what prompted you to write it? What drew you to the idea of thinking and looking so heavily into the subject of stress? I mean, clearly it's an important topic, but I was curious as to what drew you to that topic as an area to research more, to write a book about.
Yeah, so that was also really about this sort of crossover between my interest in dogs and animal behavior and my interest in science, because when I started the PhD program, I had been uh, training dogs professionally for about 7 or 8 years, I think, at that point. And so I knew, I'd taken a whole bunch of seminars and gone to conferences, and I knew a fair amount about behavior. And we learned, so in graduate school, you learn a lot about stress and the impacts of stress. And I was surprised that no one was really talking about it in the animal behavior world. They were, I mean, of course, we talked about stress, and stress is bad and you should try and minimize and reduce stress. But that often was kind of where the conversation ended. And I had a case where I write about this in the book, actually, where there was a gentleman who had a dog, and he came to me when the dog was a few years old, and they had a baby on the way, and wanted to try and get the dog safe around the baby and other animals. And at that point, there had been numerous incidences of very severe aggression in a wide variety of contexts. But what really hit me about this case is that he had gone to so many trainers and tried. So, like, this dog, it came from a really severe early stress situation. It showed signs, I should say, the dog, showed signs very early on of rather serious behavior issues, and he just got bad advice after, going to professionals, right?
Mhm.
And in all of the different places he had gone for help, no one had ever had a conversation with him about the impacts of stress and how that was likely influencing this dog's behavior. And by the time he got to me, things were so severe, especially considering the living situation, that there wasn't a whole lot that we could do to to make this dog safe. And that was kind of the last straw for me, because I thought, well, there's all this information. We know so much about stress and the impacts of stress on behavior, and I just really wanted to get that information out there because I thought that it would be so valuable. So that's kind of how I arrived.
No, I agree. I think that makes sense that you would be drawn to it. And when you said you learn a lot about stress in graduate school, I wasn't sure if you meant that you learn about it or you experience it or
Well,
both.
both. Yeah.
So, um, so I'm interested in when you talk about stress, you really give some good descriptions and definitions of stress. Um, Tell us a little bit about how you would define stress. I think most all of us think we have an idea of what stress is, but how do you define it?
So stress, and I'll just say that my definition is really the scientific definition. It's not like it's something I created, but the way that stress is defined by stress researchers, is that it is a physiological response that occurs as a result of some kind of challenge to baseline, to um, often you'll hear people say homeostasis, but there's some updated language that I don't know if we'll get into it today, but just think of status quo, right? So you kind of have, you're going about your day, you're doing what you normally do. That's not particularly challenging. But then something happens. You're startled by something, you get sick, you go for a run. That is challenging. It's a change from status quo, and that your body needs to respond to that. So that is the stress response.
Okay, that's good. Now that seems to me to be like very uh, acute stress or stress that presents itself. Aren't there situations where animals live in a constant state of stress, and is that a
Yes.
different kind of stress?
It is different. I would say it's different. So the way it seems like the way that the uh, stress system evolved was really primarily to deal with acute stress, and the function of the stress response is to help the animal face whatever that challenge is. And so, actually, in many situations, stress is very beneficial. It is not in and of itself something that's negative or bad. The problems come in when the stress is either very intense, the animal doesn't have the capacity to deal with that stress, and or it's chronic. So that's what you were getting at, right? So those examples that I gave were examples of acute stress, which means it's relatively limited in time. But when an animal experiences chronic stress, the normal stress response system actually starts to fall apart and become dysregulated. And that then leads to all of these other problems, not just behavioral impacts, but also impacts on health and really the entire functioning of the organism.
Right. So I'm interested I think we'll end up talking a lot about bad stress because that's what we want to
Yeah.
learn to get rid of and how to manage. But can we touch on the fact that there is good stress? I mean, I think there are types of stress that are not necessarily concerning, and how do you differentiate them?
Right. So there is definitely good stress. And so I gave an example of going for a run. Now, for some people, that would not be good stress. For me, actually, going for a run would not be good stress, but I do really like biking. And so I can go for very long bike rides, and that's good stress for me. So exercise is good stress, learning is good stress. Anything that's different is stress.
Right.
So good stress is stress that is a challenge and the animal's able to cope with it and it's not actually distressing in the moment. So like I said, exercise, learning, traveling, going to a dance party, all of those things can be good stress. Where it starts to become something that's more negative is when you get into situations where that change, that challenge that you're being faced with is causing negative emotions. And then we can break that down even a little bit more finely where you have tolerable stress, which means, yes, this situation is upsetting. I don't like it, but I'm capable of dealing with it. I have the coping skills and I have the resources available to deal with this so that it really doesn't have any long-term negative impacts. And then the last category is toxic stress, which is when it's distressing and upsetting and the animal can't cope with that stress. So, really, what matters is the animal's ability to cope with the stressor, not necessarily the stressor itself. Although, obviously, some stressors are harder to cope with than others.
But I would imagine, and we'll talk about this more, part of dealing with stress is helping to teach dogs to cope with things that they're going to experience and not just throw things at them uh, unexpectedly. I would imagine that's a big part of it.
Mhm.
And my follow-up question I want to take before we take a break and then start asking some of those big questions is how does one go about studying stress? I mean, we all see stress, but what I liked about your book and what I'm always attracted to books that not only talk about a subject, but really give relevant data that have good resources that cite good studies. And clearly, there's a lot of studies about stress because people deal with stress all the time. How do you study it? How do you get measures and data about stress?
So that's an excellent question, Ken. You said we would be getting to the big questions, but this is actually a really big question. And it's not an easy answer. So, one of the ways that stress can be measured, so let me just go back a little bit. So, by definition, I said before that stress is a physiological response to some kind of challenge. So, one part of the physiological response is an increase in the activity of the sympathetic nervous system. So, that's the part of the nervous system that prepares us for fight or flight. And the other piece of the physiological response is an increase in stress hormones. So cortisol is the most common stress hormones in humans and people. And so one way of measuring stress is to measure cortisol levels. But this is tricky because if you'll remember, the response of like you can have a stress that someone can cope with and that it's not actually a negative experience. You can have negative experiences that individuals can cope with, and you can have negative experiences that individuals can't cope with. Measuring cortisol doesn't distinguish between the different types of stress.
Right.
So if you put a dog through if you're looking at stress in dogs and you go in and you measure cortisol levels and you see, oh, this activity that the dog did caused an increase in cortisol, all that tells us is that the dog had a stress response.
Right.
It doesn't tell us anything about the welfare or well-being of that dog in that moment. And so it doesn't mean that measures of cortisol are useless, but we have to be very careful about how they're interpreted. And so the best studies are also looking at other markers. So they might be looking at signs of that fight or flight response. So they might be looking at things like respiration or heart rate. And then they may also be looking at behavioral signs, right? Are we seeing stress related signals in the animals? So it's tricky. It's tricky to measure stress. And then there's this whole other end of things where people are really looking at well-being and how do you measure positive emotions. So I mean, I could talk for the whole rest of the hour about this, but it's tricky. That's what
No,
I'll say.
no, I appreciate that answer. I've been involved in several stress studies with animals in zoological settings, and one
Yeah.
of the challenges we faced there was that oftentimes just the very process of taking the blood sample
Yes.
elevated cortisol levels, and thus was a stressful process, but in many cases was trained in a very positive way, and the animal's overall emotional state seemed to be pretty stable and unaffected, but yet the cortisol levels were high. But yet I understand that those levels are still important to follow, but that you have to compare them or relate them to other measures and other things that you can witness as well. So
Right.
let's pause for a second. I want to take a quick sort of a commercial break, as it were, and then we'll come back and talk about how we deal with that and how we cope with that and what we need to do to help our dogs get over those kinds of levels of stress in just a minute. So we'll be right back with Dr. Spaulding. And I want to tell everybody first a little bit about Clicker Expo. If you're an animal training professional or an enthusiast, you just don't want to miss out on Clicker Expo. These conferences are a remarkable chance for you to unite with fellow trainers or enthusiasts, explore the latest techniques, enhance your skills, gain insights from the world's top positive reinforcement trainers and teachers. And one of the things that people often say about Clicker Expo is it's filled with people that really embrace positive reinforcement. And every year at Clicker Expo, we hear attendees say something like, oh, I feel right at home here. It's such a welcoming atmosphere. And that feeling seems to be true whether you come alone or with a group, whether you're highly experienced or less experienced, whether you are from a big city or from a small rural town, and whether you're already using positive reinforcement or have just come to explore it. So we just want to remind you that we hope you'll join us for Clicker Expo. We have Clicker Expo Live, our virtual conference taking place January 26th through the 28th. That's in 2024. And Clicker Expo Portland, Oregon, our in-person conference happening April 5th, 6th, and 7th. They are featuring two completely different programs, so feel free to join us for both because they're both going to be great experiences. You can register now or just find out more information by going to clickerexpo.clickertraining.com. So thank you for letting me share that information with you all. I want to say for those of you online who have questions, I see a lot of people have started putting questions in the chat window, and Juliana is going to join us a little bit later and bring some of those questions forward. So we will save time for at least 4 or 5 questions because we do see a lot of people with an interest in this topic. So Kristina, let's get back to the subject of stress. We were talking a little bit about how to study stress. And one of the things that's in the title of your book is Unlocking Resiliency and Enhancing Well-Being. And I think everybody would agree that enhancing well-being is important. I think the term resiliency is interesting. And when you and I talked, you sort of suggested that you're actually embracing maybe a different term these days. You like talking about emotional regulation. Tell us a little bit about what resiliency is, what emotional regulation is, and how that comes together to help us deal with stress or help our dogs or other animals deal with stress.
Yeah, so resilience basically just refers to the ability of an animal to cope with stress.
Right.
That's what it is. You could go maybe a little bit further and say that it's the ability to cope with stress and come out fine or maybe even better on the other end of that stress experience. And so if you look at the impacts, we haven't really talked a lot about the impacts of stress, of overwhelming stress, toxic stress, but the impacts of toxic stress are profound, and they lead to things like increased anxiety, increased depression like behavior, um, increased aggression, and increased sensitivity to fear. It's more difficult to reduce fear in animals in toxic stress, and there's a whole host of health issues that go along with overwhelming stress as well. And so it's really, really important for animals to be able to cope with stress, because as much as we want to try and reduce uh toxic stress in our animals' lives, it's just not always possible, right? Like we just can't control all of the things in the world. And so the next best thing then is helping to support the development of skills that will increase their ability to cope with stress. And there's a couple. So one of the really big topics in stress resilience is agency. And I really wish that I had thought ahead and pulled up one of my favorite definitions of agency. So I'm just going to have to try to paraphrase, which won't do it justice. But um, Svinka and Wemmelsfelder, I probably butchered those names, but they have a paper out on agency. And often, if I want to just give a short definition of agency, I'll say perceived control. That's what it is. It's the perception that the animal has control over their environment. But Svinka and Wemmelsfelder go a lot further, and they say that agency is providing opportunities for animals to explore and interact with their environment in such a way that it helps them to develop the skills that they need to cope with future challenges. And I just think that's such a powerful definition, because it really gets at why agency is important, which is really about building competency, right? So if an animal doesn't have the ability to experience agency in their lives, if they don't learn that they have the capacity to face challenges and overcome obstacles and engage in problem solving, and they don't have the opportunity to practice doing those things, then their ability to cope with stress is going to be very limited, right?
Absolutely.
Because stress is challenge, remember.
Right.
Excuse me. So we have to be able to face that challenge, which very often means engaging in problem solving behavior,
Right.
testing different things. Does this work? No, that didn't fix it. What about this? And that takes practice. So one of the best things that we can do with our animals is to give them more agency.
Right.
And I'm happy to talk about that more, but I do want to first get to the other thing you talked about, which was emotional regulation. So, emotional regulation is different than agency, but it's it's also related to stress resilience. So, and this is kind of the new hot topic in behavior research right now, primarily psychology, with humans. But so emotional regulation refers to an individual's ability to move from one unpleasant, unwanted emotion into a space where you're experiencing a more desired emotion. Or you could put it another way where it's the ability to decrease, modulate, or maintain specific emotions. So if you're feeling really angry about something and you're ready to scream at someone, and then you engage in some, deep breathing exercises, or you go work out to get those strong emotions decreased and at a more manageable level, that's emotional regulation. And what happens when an animal is not able to regulate their emotions and they're having these really strong negative emotions, that tends to motivate these impulsive behaviors that are often maladaptive, because they're engaging in these behaviors in an attempt to regulate their emotion, but they're often doing it in ways that are problematic, right? So that could be aggression, it could be destructive behavior, it could be jumping up and biting and mouthing on the people around them. Um, it and I want to clarify that we don't have research on this in dogs yet, but all of the research in humans suggests that there's a very strong link between emotional regulation and or I should say emotional dysregulation and mental health disorders, as well as aggressive behavior. And we really have no reason to believe that the same would not be true in other animals, particularly mammals.
No, I agree. I think that those are great points, and I think the discussion of emotional regulation and agency are interrelated in a lot of ways. I work a
Mhm.
lot with working dog teams, and sometimes some of the best working dog teams, the most successful working dog teams. And for me, successful means I see a relaxed, comfortable animal
Yeah.
that they do well in those situations when they have been taught to problem solve, when they've been taught that in these situations you're going to have choices and you can make those choices. You have the agency to make that decision for yourself because we've taught you the skills to make good choices and make the appropriate choices. And in the end, I often see those animals that have been taught those skills have really learned how to cope, how to overcome, how to get around obstacles, how to do things that
Yep.
they weren't able to do at the beginning. And those obstacles created huge levels of stress at the beginning, but as they've learned how to cope with them, they come into those situations, they go, oh, I know what to do here, and they do it quite well, and their level of stress appears, because we're not measuring it at the time, we're just looking at it, but from an observational point of view, they seem much more relaxed and seem much more eager to keep on working and keep doing those kinds of things. So I think they are so interrelated, and they're so connected to so many things that we as trainers do on a regular basis. And we can do things that add to that stress, or we can do things that
Mhm.
help it and alleviate it, or help them learn to cope with it.
Yeah, definitely
So
agree.
I think before we take the next break, we've got a couple of questions that have come in. So I'm going to ask Juliana to join us and see if we've had any real good questions for Dr. Spaulding come in so far.
Yeah, we've got some good ones. And I want to squeeze in my own really quickly. Both of you have mentioned the term coping many times. And can you just briefly maybe say an example, a scenario example with a pet dog of what coping with stress would look like, what a guardian can look for in their dog that would say, oh, my dog is coping with stress or is able to cope with stress?
Just one thing. So I'm going to give you two answers because I just can't help myself. So one thing that I think is a really good thing to look for is recovery time. So something unpleasant happened, or even something pleasant happened. How long does it take the dog to bring themselves back down to baseline? So so that's a really I would say that's a good way to assess coping. If you want an example of a specific coping skill, I mean, this could be tons of different things, but one example would be um, that if the dog is feeling anxious about something, that they disengage from that situation and go off and like sniff the ground or go start playing with a toy or something like that.
Great. I think that's really helpful to wrap your head around what coping is. That was very helpful. Thank you. So, okay, we have one question. Exhibiting stress. I've always been told dogs can appear hyper or they can appear shut down. True question mark?
So, yes, there are elements of truth to that. I don't think it's always completely either or. And here, unfortunately, we are missing some information that I think is really important. Like, I mean, we don't have research on it, so we're just sort of operating in a black box. So, dog behaviorists talk about, and trainers talk about stressing up and stressing down. So, usually, stressing up is that activated, you might be jumping, you might be barking, you might be lunging at the end of the leash. And stressing down is that shutting down where they become kind of very still and they're not really engaging in a lot of behavior. And yes, it does appear that these are two different types of stress responses. And in the scientific literature, what you see is discussion of different coping styles. So you have one coping style which has several different names. I'm just going to give you one so it's less confusing. You have an active coping style, which is characterized by increased exploration, relatively higher activation of the sympathetic nervous system, so that adrenaline response, and increased ability to cope effectively with stress. And then you have the more passive coping style, which is characterized by more freezing behavior and decreased exploration, decreased movement, decreased ability to cope with stress, as well as relatively higher stress hormone release. So I just want to make sure I'm clear here. So in both cases, in both active and passive, the animal is experiencing stress. That means that they're showing an increased adrenaline response and an increased cortisol response. But the animals that are active copers, both things increase, but they have a greater increase of the adrenaline response. Whereas passive copers, both things increase, but they have a relatively higher increase in cortisol. And when I talk about their ability to cope with stress, typically the way that is measured, a lot of these studies are being done on wild animals. And often the way that is measured is in either susceptibility to disease and or other measures related to survival. So one of the many things that toxic stress does is it impairs the function of the immune system. So if an animal is experiencing a lot of toxic stress, they become more susceptible to disease. So the passive copers are more likely to.
And would you say, Kristina, that there's also an aspect that's hard to measure that has a little bit to do with previous training history? Because I've seen dogs that appear very hyper because they're excited about what they're about to do, or that who appear very calm because they've been taught to be calm. And then when given the opportunity to engage in the activity, often they sort of come back to normal pretty quickly because they seem to enjoy that activity. And that's different than perhaps an unexpected reaction that you see, or does that even matter? I'm making a big supposition here and I'm asking a question.
So we don't have a great understanding of the different things that influence coping styles. There probably is a temperamental component to it, which basically means genetic. But as with everything, experience probably does matter as well. And one of the types of experience that probably really matters in this case is how much agency the animal has experienced. So if they've had more agency in their life history, they're probably more likely to show active coping than passive coping.
That makes sense. Hey, you know what, Juliana, maybe we have time for one more question before we go to break.
Okay, speaking on those active and passive coping, do you feel like an individual dog can show both depending on the conditions, or is it generally they're going to be one or the other?
Okay, so based on personal observation, yes, probably. Although I don't think it's very common. I mean, I think you're typically going to see one or the other. Based on research, I don't think we really have that data. I'm not aware of studies looking at that. They're really focused on identifying which type this animal has and then how it impacts other aspects of behavior. Because remember, a lot of this research is being done on wild animals. And so their motivation for asking these questions is slightly different than what our motivations would be. There is some research that does back up the idea that dogs also show active and passive coping, but even those studies are really not looking at like the impact of context, for example, and whether they can show different responses in this in different contexts. But again, agency probably has an influence. So if you have the same animal is in one context where they have a history of high agency, they're probably going to be more likely to show active coping. Whereas you could have that same animal in a context where um, the history has been very little control or agency, they're probably going to be more likely to show passive coping.
That's great. I think, well, I wanted to take a break first, but when we come back from the break, I think the important thing, there's so many fascinating topics that we've opened the door to that we could go down lots of different pathways. But I want to make sure that we take some time to share with our viewers some practical things that they can do when they see or sense that their animals are stressed, how they can relieve it, how they can mitigate it, etc. That's what we're going to talk about on the other side of the break. So we'll be right back. And before we go, I wanted to tell everybody a little bit about the fact that last month I shared with everybody that our 2024 week-long courses at the ranch were open for registration. And that, of course, is still true. But I'm also excited to share that our weekend events are now also available with some really great new options this year. For example, in June, I'm going to be doing a brand new workshop called Success Under All Conditions that will have dog handler and learner spots. And in that, we're going to be actually talking about a lot of things that I hope will help relieve and deal with stress. I mean, I think it's really a workshop about desensitization and generalization and how to be successful with your dog in all conditions. And I'm really excited about that brand new workshop that we're going to be offering this next year at the ranch. And then in August, we're going to welcome Dr. Susan Friedman back to a special guest at the ranch workshop. It's called The Magic is in the Data. We debuted that program a couple of years ago. It sold out. It was so popular that we're bringing Susan back again to have that conversation about the value of data, how to take data, what to do with that data, and how that can impact your training and make you a better trainer. And finally, in September, again, backed by popular demand, I will be doing a seminar focused entirely on handling problem behavior and mistakes. It is the most common thing that people want to deal with and want to ask questions about. And I'm going to talk about a lot of the different strategies that you can use for that. So if you want to find out more about our courses at the ranch, go to theranch.clickertraining.com. And there you'll find all sorts of information about both our week-long courses and our weekend courses that'll be starting up in April of 2024. All right. Let's get back to the topic at hand. So, Kristina, we've been talking about a lot of different things, and the question that I think is important for most of us is, if we see stress, if we are worried about stress, what kinds of things should we be looking for, and what kinds of things should we actively put in place that can alleviate stress and assist us in making our dogs' lives better?
Yeah, so I think one thing that's really important is getting very good at reading body language and then learning how to respond appropriately to it. And I'm not going to get into how to read body language now because it would take the rest of the hour and longer. But there are definitely good resources online. So if you are interacting with your animal, and I primarily work with dogs, so I tend to say dogs, but this is not at all limited to just dogs. If you are interacting with an animal and it is displaying signs of distress, I should say, that is a sign that maybe we need to reevaluate things. And this is one place where we can give space to the animal to have control over their situation. So this can be something as simple as, you have a dog, you're out in public, someone asks to pet the dog indicates that they're not interested in that interaction. And then you say, I'm sorry, no, they're not interested, or whatever you want to say to them. But making sure that we are protecting our animals' uh, wishes and preferences and keeping them safe and advocating for them, right? So when we talk about increasing agency, I often hear examples like let your dog choose which direction to go on a walk. And that's great. There's nothing wrong with that. But I think there are more meaningful things that we can do. And for some dogs, that's going to be very meaningful, right? But for others, it might be less so. But the control over how other people are interacting with your body, that's going to be very meaningful for all animals. So that's one thing. And that gets us into all kinds of other things like fear-free vet care, cooperative care, all of that. But even at a most basic level, just does my animal want to engage in this interaction right now? And if they don't, respecting that, unless, of course, it's an emergency or something. But 99% of the time, it's not. So that's one thing. And then there's enrichment. So remember that agency, that definition that I gave you of agency is having the opportunity to interact with the world in a way that allows the development of skills to cope with future challenges. So enrichment is one really great way to do that because you're putting the animal in different situations where they are having new experiences, and as long as you're monitoring that body language and making sure that they're comfortable with that interaction and giving them the agency to opt out, then like Ken was talking about with the working dogs, right? They then have to go into this new thing and figure out how to navigate it and what it is and how to respond to things and what works and what doesn't work. And that experience then should help in the future when they're faced with other situations that may be potentially distressing or where there's uncertainty involved. And one of the things that I really kind of go on about is that I have come to believe, and I totally, I've not always been there, but over the last several years, I've come to feel very strongly that when it comes to walking dogs, and again, I'm sure this could apply to other animals, like horses come to mind immediately. It's really important that we allow them to stop and look at their environment. I cannot tell you how often I got the question when I was working with clients. My dog keeps stopping on walks. How can I make them keep walking? And I used to have method, right? It's like, oh, you toss treats and you do all these other things to keep them walking. I don't recommend that anymore because I now believe so either it's fear, it's a medical problem, or the animal is gathering information about their environment. You could also have an animal that doesn't want to go home because they don't want the walk to end. So there's that too. But I think in many cases, particularly with young dogs, they need to look at their environment to figure out what is going on. And if we don't allow them to do that, I think that that's really impairing their ability to be able to cope with these unknown, unfamiliar experiences. And we don't have data on this. This hasn't been studied yet, but I suspect that that sort of rushing our dogs through walks is actually contributing to on-leash reactivity.
And when you say, Kristina, that it's good for them to be able to look at their environment, that includes sniff and smell
Yes.
their environment, right?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, yeah.
Yes. So, but often, and I think the reason I say look is because the examples that I think of, so I guess there's two situations, right? They want to keep smelling and we're not allowing them to continue to smell. So let them keep smelling. But there's also situations where they plant their feet, right? And they're like looking around. I don't know if people can see my video. I think they can.
Yes.
And and the response tends to be either drag them with you or try and convince them to keep going. And I think often they just need to take in the information around them. But or it could be listening, right? Often it's listening. They hear a noise, they want to see what that is. So you're right. It's not just visual, it's all of the senses that they need to be experiencing. I might draw the line a little bit at taste. They don't necessarily need to taste all the things along the walk, but
Yeah. And of course, you're talking about all of these things with and using some good reasoning in the middle of it all. There are times that you may not want the dog to look or to sniff
right.
something, but generally speaking, it's giving them that opportunity to take in what's around them, is what you're suggesting. Um, I have so many questions that I'd like to ask, but I want to bring Juliana back in. Juliana has the opportunity to sort of listen in and think of questions that she sees that we haven't addressed, and she, of course, is reading our viewers, and we've got a lot of people writing in with questions. So, Juliana, I'm going to turn it over to you for a minute and see where we want to go next with questions.
Sure. So you just mentioned enrichment in terms of agency. And so this question is, does enrichment relate directly with coping mechanisms?
Yes. So if you look at the resilience research, there are 5 things that have been identified that improve an animal's ability to cope with stress. So, one of them is increasing agency, one of them is enrichment, one of them is physical exercise, social support, which basically means um, having access to another animal, um, really just having access to another supportive animal. So it could be potentially another dog, it could be a human, it could be another species, you know, same species, but access to some other animal, generally that's calm and not like combative, right? So like petting your dog when they are scared is 100% fine. And actually, the research suggests that it is likely to help things um, rather than hurt them in any way. Like it's not even neutral, right? It's probably beneficial. And then the last one is the one that has to do with qualities of the stressor. So stressors that are predictable are easier to cope with. And then obviously, if they're less intense, they're easier to cope with. And if they're in shorter duration, they're easier to cope with.
And when you say a stressor is predictable, again, thinking in the example of like a pet dog, is that something like the male person comes at the same time every day, that type of predictable? Or like I'm pulling out the clippers so you know exactly what's going to happen in this event, grooming event, predictable?
Both.
Okay.
Which is not to say, because I think some people might hear this and think, well, this thing happens and it's predictable and my animal's still stressed about it. None of these things that I'm listing automatically bring stress down to 0, right? But if there's a routine and you take out every Monday evening, you take out the food and you take out the clippers and the dog gets on the couch and you clip the nails, that's very different than at random times you grab the dog and clip their nails, right?
Yep.
So it's just remember that all these things are relative. It's not that exercising makes all stress go away, but ability to physically exercise is likely to increase an animal's ability to cope with stress.
Right. That's great. How about another question, Juliana? I know there's a lot of them coming in, and I just want to make sure we get around to a couple more.
I think this one's really interesting. What do you think about the theory that a handler's stress levels can affect the animal?
So we have some data on this, and the data that we do have indicates that there is a relationship. So there's a relationship between the human handler's stress and the animal's stress. And when I say relationship, I mean just that. Can we say that the handler's stress is causing an increase in dog stress? Not based on the studies that have been done. All we can say is that there's a relationship there. So if the handler has higher stress, the dog tends to have higher stress too. But you could also say if the dog has higher stress, the handler tends to have higher stress too.
Yeah.
We just don't know what direction it's going in. So that's true. We also know that there are relationships between, for example, personality traits of the dog's caregiver and the behavior of the dog, which that suggests a little bit more that it is going from the human to the dog, because we're talking about personality traits, which are relatively stable. And I'll just touch on this because I don't know much about it yet. But I'm starting to dig into the research on emotional regulation and looking at what the research tells us, because again, they're not studying this in dogs yet. Barely, but there's a lot more research in humans. And so what techniques are being used to promote emotional regulation in children? And I'm coming across a lot of studies that are focusing on the impact of the parents' emotional regulation on the children. And so all of those three things together suggest that there is a very strong relationship that's probably bidirectional between the stress and emotional state of the humans and the dogs. And again, probably is also true for other species, especially mammals, because the mammals are all kind of the same, at least when it comes to stress.
You know, we're almost out of time. I'm going to allow us to go over by just a little bit so that we can take one more question, Juliana.
Okay, this is something to apply for dog trainers. We often see eustress and distress used to label the positive and negative. Do you have alternative common language that you use with clients?
Yeah, well, yes. So what I was talking about earlier when I was talking about good, tolerable, and toxic stress, that's my preferred language. And I want to credit this to Bruce McEwen, who is one of the sort of founders of the stress field. He's the one that came up with this terminology. So eustress is the same as good stress, basically. But then he divides distress further into tolerable and toxic stress. And I think that additional category is really useful because it really speaks to, is this unpleasant, but you're going to be okay? Or is this unpleasant and it's really causing things to unravel?
Mm-hmm.
Excellent. You know, Dr. Spaulding, first, I just got to say thank you. I love the thoughtfulness with which you answer questions. You think about, and then you either say, we don't know a lot about this. This is what I'm thinking, or this is what I'm seeing in the human research. I think there's a tendency for many of us in the dog training community when we get asked a question to just quickly jump to our go-to answer without really qualifying whether it's researched or whether it's based on your experience or whether it's based on something else. And I think that was you modeled that very, very well. I also like the fact that when you said we don't know a lot about that yet, I love the yet part of it, because I think that's a good point. There's just so many areas where research is really, really valuable. So I just want to say to all of our viewers, if you found this topic interesting, I really encourage you to look at this particular book. We didn't publish it. It isn't from us. It's just a good book, and it's worth being aware of. The Stress Factor in Dogs by Dr. Kristina Spaulding. Kristina, thank you so much for being with us today. We are out of time, so I'm going to let you go. I know you've got a busy schedule as well, but we really appreciate you being with us here on Live from the Ranch.
Thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you so much. So I want to remind everybody that we do come on the first Thursday of every month. And next month, January, oh my goodness, it's a new year. And if you join us next in January, my guest will be Katie Gillette. We'll be talking about the work that she's doing with dogs that live on reservations and some of the challenges those dogs face and many of the other interesting aspects that come with dogs that are found on reservations. And so that will be January 4th on Live from the Ranch. And then we want to remind you that if you have suggestions or ideas or things that you'd like to suggest for future episodes or things that you want to contribute, you can always go to our website and go to the Watch Live, go to the comment section, and there you'll find all the information about ways that you can submit questions and information to us about future broadcasts of Live from the Ranch. And finally, a summary of all of the different offers that we made today. We want to remind you that if you're interested in becoming a dog trainer, you can check out KPA, Kieran Pryor Academy. We have lots of different ways of learning about dog training. And then we always are talking about Clicker Expo because it's one of the highlights of the year for us as we talk about and share great trainers, great scientists, and great teachers in the positive reinforcement world who are going to be presenting at our live virtual expo in January, the 26th through the 28th, or the in-person expo in Portland, Oregon in April. That's the 5th through the 7th. And finally, I would be remiss if I didn't remind you that I'd love to see all of you here at my home. The ranch is where we have the Kieran Pryor National Training Center, and we offer a variety of week-long courses as well as weekend courses. All of those courses are now on our website. We encourage you to check those things out, and we encourage you and remind you to please come back and see us again in January for our next edition of Live from the Ranch. Bye-bye.